Picture this. A locksmith working alone in the bowels of America's first penitentiary suddenly feels invisible hands grab him from behind, pulling him into the darkness of a cell that hasn't held a living prisoner in decades. This isn't fiction. This happened to Gary Johnson in the very place I'm about to take you, Eastern State Penitentiary, where the boundary between the living and the dead dissolved long before the last inmate walked free. But Gary's terrifying encounter is just the beginning of a story so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong about the nature of human punishment and spiritual imprisonment, that it will make you question everything you think you know about justice, suffering, and whether some places on earth can become so saturated with human anguish that they trap souls forever. Stay with me, because what I'm about to reveal about America's most haunted prison will show you why some forms of punishment are so cruel that they echo through eternity. Before we descend into the psychological hell that is Eastern State Penitentiary, I need you to understand something crucial about what we're exploring together. This isn't just another ghost story or historical curiosity. This is an investigation into how human cruelty can become so profound that it transcends death itself. If you're drawn to stories that don't just entertain but fundamentally challenge your understanding of justice, morality, and the very nature of consciousness after death, then you need to subscribe to this channel right now. We don't just tell ghost stories here. We excavate the darkest truths about human nature. And I promise you that every video will leave you with questions that will haunt your quiet moments long after you've turned off your screen. October 25th, 1829. The massive wooden doors of Eastern State Penitentiary swung open for the first time, revealing what its creators believed would be a revolutionary approach to criminal justice. But what they had actually created was something far more sinister, a machine designed to systematically destroy the human spirit through a form of psychological torture so refined, so methodically cruel, that it would leave psychic scars on the very walls themselves. Located in Philadelphia, this imposing fortress with its 30-foot-high walls and Gothic architecture wasn't just built to contain criminals. It was designed to break them completely, to strip away every vestige of human connection and dignity, until nothing remained but a hollowed-out shell of a person, crushed under the weight of absolute solitude. The Quakers who conceived this humane alternative to physical punishment had no idea they were creating what would become one of the most psychologically devastating forms of incarceration ever devised. The system they implemented was called separate confinement, but the clinical term fails to capture the existential horror of what it actually meant to live under its rules. Imagine being sealed inside a cell barely large enough to accommodate your body, with walls so thick that no sound from the outside world could penetrate. The silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a living, breathing entity that pressed against your eardrums and filled your lungs until you could taste the emptiness. Each cell contained only a Bible, a mattress, and a wooden bucket, because the reformers believed that in this sterile environment of total isolation, criminals would be forced to confront their sins and achieve genuine repentance. What they didn't anticipate was how quickly the human mind begins to unravel when deprived of all social contact, all stimulation, all connection to the world beyond those suffocating stone walls. The daily routine at Eastern State was designed with the precision of a psychological experiment, each element carefully calibrated to maximize the prisoner's sense of disconnection from humanity. Inmates were forbidden to speak, to sing, to hum, or make any sound that might indicate the presence of a living soul. When they were moved from their cells, a rare occurrence reserved for exercise or religious instruction, black hoods were placed over their heads so they could not see other prisoners or be seen by them. The guards spoke only when absolutely necessary, and even then in whispers, as if the very act of human communication might contaminate the purity of the solitary experience. Can you imagine living in a world where your own voice becomes a foreign sound, where the simple act of greeting another human being is treated as a crime more serious than the one that brought you there in the first place. The architecture of Eastern State was itself a weapon in this war against the human spirit. The building was designed in a radial pattern, with 7 long corridors extending like spokes from a central hub, allowing a single guard to observe all the cell blocks simultaneously. This panopticon effect meant that prisoners could never know when they were being watched, adding a layer of paranoid uncertainty to their already unbearable isolation. The cells themselves were marvels of cruel efficiency, each one equipped with its own private exercise yard, a small outdoor space surrounded by walls so high that prisoners could see nothing but a small patch of sky. Even this glimpse of the natural world was carefully controlled, allowing just enough hope to make the despair more acute. The cells had running water and central heating, luxuries that were advertised as evidence of the facility's humanitarian approach. But these creature comforts only served to make the psychological torture more insidious by removing any excuse for the prisoner's obvious mental deterioration. Within months of the prison's opening, the first signs of what would become a plague of madness began to manifest. Prisoners started exhibiting behaviors that guards had never seen before. Men who had been hardened criminals on the outside became catatonic, staring at walls for hours without blinking. Others began talking to imaginary companions, holding elaborate conversations with the voices that filled the silence their minds could no longer tolerate. Some prisoners became so desperate for human contact that they would deliberately injure themselves just to experience the brief interaction with a doctor or guard that medical treatment would provide. The most disturbing cases were those who seemed to split into multiple personalities, as if their isolated minds had created entire populations of imaginary people to keep them company in their solitary hell. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Eastern State's psychological warfare was how it affected even its most famous inmates. Alphonse Al Capone, the Chicago gangster who had terrorized an entire city and commanded an army of ruthless criminals, was reduced to a gibbering, paranoid wreck during his 8 months in the prison. Capone, a man who had ordered the execution of dozens of people without showing the slightest remorse, became convinced that he was being haunted by the ghost of one of his victims, James Clark, who had been gunned down in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Night after night, Capone would scream that Clark was in his cell, demanding revenge, tormenting him with visions of the brutal death he had orchestrated. The guards initially assumed this was an act, a clever performance designed to get Capone transferred to a more comfortable facility. But as his terror became increasingly genuine, and his mental state continued to deteriorate, it became clear that even the most hardened criminal mind could not withstand the psychological assault of Eastern State's separate system. What makes Capone's haunting even more disturbing is that it didn't end when he was released from Eastern State. The psychological damage inflicted by his time in solitary confinement had opened something in his mind that could never be closed again. For the rest of his life, Capone would be tormented by visions and voices, convinced that the spirits of his victims were following him wherever he went. He hired mediums and psychics in a desperate attempt to communicate with these entities and perhaps find some form of peace, but nothing worked. The torment that began in his cell at Eastern State followed him to his mansion in Florida, where he would spend his final years as a broken man, his powerful criminal empire reduced to nothing by the relentless assault of his own guilt and the ghostly presences that seemed to emanate from the very walls of that terrible prison. Can you imagine being so psychologically destroyed by a place that it continues to haunt you decades after you've left, following you like a curse that can never be lifted? The systematic brutality of Eastern State's punishment methods extended far beyond mere isolation. Prisoners who violated the prison's numerous rules faced additional torments that seemed designed more to satisfy some sadistic impulse than to achieve any rehabilitative purpose. The water cure involved dunking prisoners in freezing water during winter months and then hanging them on the walls until ice began to form on their bodies. The iron gag was a torture device that locked a prisoner's tongue to a collar around their neck, making any movement excruciatingly painful and effectively preventing speech for days or even weeks. Perhaps most horrifying was the mad chair, a restraint device that strapped prisoners in a sitting position for so long that circulation would be cut off to their limbs, causing permanent damage and, in some cases, gangrene that required amputation. These weren't isolated incidents of guard brutality. They were official punishment methods, approved by the prison administration and carried out with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of Eastern State's operation. The cumulative effect of these physical and psychological torments was predictable, yet somehow shocking in its totality. Suicide attempts became so common that the prison had to develop special protocols for preventing self-harm, including the removal of any object that could be used as a weapon against oneself. Some prisoners found ways to end their suffering despite these precautions, hanging themselves with strips of bedding or finding other creative methods to escape their unbearable existence. Others simply retreated so far into madness that they became living ghosts, their bodies surviving while their minds had already fled to whatever refuge they could find in insanity. The prison's medical records, what few survive, paint a picture of a systematic mental destruction so thorough that it challenges our fundamental assumptions about human resilience and the soul's capacity to endure suffering. As decades passed and the horror stories from Eastern State began to leak out to the public, prison reformers and medical experts started to speak out against the separate system. Charles Dickens, the famous British author, visited Eastern State in 1842 and was so appalled by what he witnessed that he wrote a scathing condemnation of the prison, describing it as a place where the slow and daily tampering with the mysteries of the brain was more cruel than any physical torture ever devised. Dickens observed prisoners who had been driven to such depths of despair that they no longer seemed human, men who had been so thoroughly broken by their isolation that they could not even remember their own names or recognize their own faces in mirrors. He wrote that the prison seemed designed not to reform criminals but to extinguish the last spark of humanity in those unfortunate enough to be confined there. But by the time these criticisms began to mount, Eastern State had already left an indelible mark on the thousands of men and women who had passed through its cells. The psychological trauma inflicted by the separate system didn't simply disappear when prisoners were released. It followed them into the outside world, creating a population of former inmates who were often more damaged than when they had first been incarcerated. Many became homeless, unable to readjust to a world that required social interaction and communication. Others committed new crimes almost immediately upon release, as if they were subconsciously seeking a return to the familiar horror of solitary confinement, rather than face the overwhelming challenge of reconnecting with humanity. Some simply disappeared entirely, becoming urban legends themselves, broken people who haunted the margins of society like living ghosts, forever changed by their encounter with Eastern State's systematic dehumanization. The prison officially closed in 1971, but closing the doors could not contain what had been created within those walls over 142 years of systematic psychological torture. The building stood empty for years, slowly deteriorating as weather and time took their toll on the Gothic architecture. But something else was happening in that silence. Something that the guards and maintenance workers who occasionally entered the facility began to report with increasing frequency. Voices echoed through empty corridors where no living person walked. Cell doors slammed shut with tremendous force despite the absence of any wind or physical cause. Shadowy figures were glimpsed moving through areas of the prison that were supposed to be completely empty. The scent of human fear and desperation seemed to permeate the very stones, creating an atmosphere so oppressive that even the most skeptical visitors found themselves rushing toward the exits. When Eastern State reopened as a historic site and museum in the 1990s, these paranormal reports not only continued but intensified dramatically. Tour guides began to collect accounts from visitors who had experienced things that defied rational explanation. In Cell Block 12, multiple witnesses reported seeing the shadowy figure of a man walking through the corridor, always moving in the same direction, always disappearing at the same spot near the end of the block. Security cameras captured this apparition on several occasions, and when the footage was enhanced and analyzed, investigators were stunned to see what appeared to be a solid, three-dimensional figure that cast no shadow and seemed to move independently of any natural laws of physics. The most chilling aspect of these sightings was the figure's apparent awareness of the living observers. Several witnesses reported making eye contact with the entity, describing eyes that held depths of suffering and rage that seemed to encompass decades of accumulated torment. Even more disturbing were the reports from the prison's former punishment areas, particularly the basement cells where the most brutal disciplinary measures had been carried out. Visitors to these areas consistently reported feeling an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia and panic, even in spaces that were objectively large enough to accommodate them comfortably. The air itself seemed to thicken in these rooms, becoming difficult to breathe as if it were saturated with the terror and anguish of countless prisoners who had been tortured there over the decades. Several sensitive individuals claimed to hear screaming emanating from the walls themselves, not echoing from any identifiable source but seeming to emerge from the very stones that had witnessed so much human suffering. Psychic investigators who visited these areas reported making contact with entities who identified themselves as former prisoners, men who claimed they were still trapped in Eastern State, still experiencing the psychological torture that had defined their earthly existence. Among the most frequently reported entities at Eastern State is a figure known among staff and visitors as the Soap Lady, a female apparition that allegedly appears consistently in what was once the women's section of the prison. Unlike the reportedly angry, tormented male spirits that seem to inhabit most of the facility, this figure appears calm and resigned, according to witnesses, with multiple people describing her as sitting quietly in the same cell day after day, year after year, as if she has accepted her eternal presence there. Staff members report seeing her so frequently that they have begun to refer to her as a permanent resident rather than a supernatural phenomenon. What makes these sightings particularly poignant is the historical context. Records show that several women died in that section of the prison during the late 1800s, victims of the separate system's psychological torture, who simply could not endure the relentless isolation. The possibility that one of these women might still be sitting in her cell, trapped in an endless loop of despair and resignation, forces us to confront the disturbing question of whether some forms of suffering are so profound they transcend the boundary between life and death. Perhaps the most compelling evidence of Eastern State's supernatural activity comes from the extensive paranormal investigations that have been conducted there by some of the world's most respected ghost hunters and researchers. When the producers of Ghost Hunters brought their equipment to Eastern State, they captured what they described as some of the most convincing evidence of paranormal activity they had ever recorded. In Cell Block 12, their cameras documented a dark, solid figure moving through the corridor. Not a trick of light or shadow, but something that appeared to have genuine mass and substance. When the footage was analyzed, frame by frame, investigators were astounded to see that the figure seemed to interact with the environment in ways that suggested consciousness and intent. Even more remarkable was the electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, recording they captured in one of the isolation cells. A clear, distinctly human voice saying, "I knew God. God." the voice was layered with such profound sadness and spiritual anguish that it moved several team members to tears. The investigative team from Ghost Adventures had an even more disturbing experience when they conducted their lockdown investigation at Eastern State. During their time in the facility, they reported being physically touched by unseen entities, hearing their names called by voices that seemed to come from within the walls themselves, and experiencing sudden temperature drops so severe that their breath became visible in rooms that had been comfortably warm just moments before. But the most unnerving incident occurred when investigator Zach Bagans claimed to make direct contact with the spirit of a former prisoner who had died in one of the punishment cells. According to Bagans, the entity communicated not through EVPS or other equipment, but through direct mental contact, flooding his consciousness with images and emotions so intense that he had to leave the investigation area. The spirit, he reported, was desperate to tell someone about the horrors he had endured, the years of psychological torture that had driven him to madness and ultimately death. The experience left Bagans visibly shaken, and he later described it as one of the most profound supernatural encounters of his career. But it's not just professional paranormal investigators who have encountered the supernatural residents of Eastern State. Ordinary visitors, people who came to the prison simply to learn about its history, have found themselves face to face with entities that challenge everything they thought they knew about death and the afterlife. Gary Johnson, the locksmith whose encounter I mentioned at the beginning of this investigation, was just doing routine maintenance work when he felt invisible hands grab him and attempt to pull him into one of the empty cells. Johnson, a practical man who had never believed in ghosts, was so traumatized by the experience that he immediately quit his job and refused to ever enter the prison again. His description of the incident, the sensation of cold, desperate fingers clutching at his clothing, the overwhelming smell of human desperation and fear, the feeling that something was trying to drag him into the same psychological hell that had claimed so many others, remains one of the most compelling first-hand accounts of supernatural contact ever recorded at Eastern State. What makes these encounters particularly chilling is their consistency across decades of reports. The same locations within the prison, cell block 12, the punishment cells, the former medical ward, continue to be sites of supernatural activity, as if certain areas of the facility have become permanent gateways between our world and whatever realm these tormented souls now inhabit. The entities themselves seem to follow predictable patterns of behavior, appearing at similar times, in similar ways, to different witnesses who have no knowledge of previous encounters. This consistency suggests that we're not dealing with random hallucinations or psychological phenomena, but with genuine supernatural presences that have maintained their connection to Eastern State long after their physical bodies have ceased to exist. Would you walk alone through those corridors at midnight, knowing that you might encounter one of these entities face to face? Could you maintain your sanity if you suddenly found yourself making eye contact with a soul that has been trapped in psychological torment for over a century? The question of why Eastern State has become such a powerful supernatural hotspot leads us to consider some deeply unsettling possibilities about the nature of consciousness, suffering, and death itself. The sheer volume of psychological trauma that was inflicted within those walls over nearly a century and a half may have created what paranormal researchers call a residual haunting, a kind of psychic echo where intense emotions and experiences become imprinted on the physical environment itself. But the interactive nature of many of the encounters at Eastern State suggests something far more disturbing than mere psychic recordings. These entities seem to retain their consciousness, their memories, and their desperate need to communicate with the living world. They appear to be trapped not just in the physical location of the prison, but in the psychological state they occupied at the moment of their death, a state of profound isolation, terror, and spiritual desperation that was artificially created and maintained by the separate system. This possibility forces us to confront one of the most terrifying questions about human existence. Can suffering be so intense and prolonged that it fundamentally alters the soul's ability to find peace after death? The separate system at Eastern State was specifically designed to break down the psychological defenses that allow humans to maintain their sanity under stress. By systematically removing every source of comfort, connection, and hope, the prison created conditions that were more psychologically devastating than any physical torture ever devised. The result was not just madness, but a kind of spiritual destruction that may have left its victims unable to transition properly from life to death. If this is true, then Eastern State stands as a monument not just to the cruelty of which humans are capable, but to the possibility that some forms of evil are so profound they can corrupt the very nature of existence itself, trapping souls in eternal torment that makes their earthly suffering seem mild by comparison. The legacy of Eastern State extends far beyond its role as a tourist attraction or paranormal investigation site. The prison served as a model for correctional facilities around the world, and its influence can still be seen in the design and philosophy of modern prisons. The psychological techniques pioneered at Eastern State, isolation, sensory deprivation, the systematic removal of human contact, continue to be used in supermax facilities and solitary confinement units across the United States and beyond. This means that the same spiritual poison that created Eastern State's supernatural activity is still being administered to prisoners today, potentially creating new generations of souls who may find themselves trapped in the same kind of eternal psychological torment that continues to manifest within those Gothic walls. The ghosts of Eastern State are not just historical curiosities, they are warnings about what happens when punishment becomes so cruel that it damages the fundamental essence of human consciousness. As you walk through Eastern State today, breathing in air that still carries the psychic residue of 142 years of systematic torture, you can feel the weight of all that accumulated suffering pressing down on you like a physical force. The walls themselves seem to watch you, as if they have absorbed the consciousness of everyone who ever suffered within their confines and developed a malevolent awareness of their own. The silence is not peaceful, but predatory, pregnant with the echoes of screams that were never allowed to be voiced, prayers that were never answered, and pleas for mercy that fell on deaf ears. Every shadow seems to move independently of any light source, and every sound, the drip of water, the settling of old stones, the whisper of wind through broken windows, takes on an ominous significance that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. But here's what I want you to consider. If you were forced to spend just 1 hour alone in the darkest corner of that prison, surrounded by the accumulated spiritual pressure of centuries of human despair, would you emerge unchanged? Can you imagine spending even a single night alone in one of those cells, surrounded by the accumulated spiritual pressure of centuries of human despair? The most disturbing realization about Eastern State is not that it's haunted, but why it's haunted. The supernatural activity that permeates the facility is not the result of random tragedy or accidental death. It's the direct consequence of deliberate, systematic psychological torture that was designed specifically to break the human spirit. Every ghost that walks those corridors, every voice that whispers in the darkness, every cold touch that makes visitors flee in terror, represents a soul that was so thoroughly destroyed by the separate system that death itself could not provide escape from their suffering. These entities are not just visiting our world. They are trapped between worlds, unable to move on because the psychological damage inflicted upon them was so complete that it corrupted their very essence. They remain bound to Eastern State not by choice, but because the prison succeeded in its ultimate goal of breaking them so completely that they lost the capacity for spiritual freedom even after their physical bodies had ceased to function. This understanding transforms Eastern State from a mere haunted location into something far more profound and terrifying. A glimpse into the darkest possibilities of human consciousness and the terrible price of cruelty that extends beyond death itself. The prison stands as irrefutable evidence that some forms of evil are so complete, so systematically destructive, that they can fundamentally alter the nature of existence for their victims. The separate system didn't just punish criminals, it created a form of suffering so intense and prolonged that it transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, creating a permanent scar on the fabric of reality itself. Every paranormal encounter at Eastern State is a reminder that the consequences of extreme cruelty don't end when the perpetrators die or when the institution closes its doors. They echo through eternity, creating ripples of spiritual damage that can never be fully healed. As we reach the end of our journey into the spiritual darkness of Eastern State Penitentiary, we're left with questions that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about justice, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. What does it mean that a place designed to create repentance instead created eternal damnation? How do we reconcile our belief in the possibility of redemption with the evidence that some forms of suffering can corrupt the soul so completely that not even death provides release? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does the continued existence of these tormented entities tell us about our own capacity for evil and the lasting consequences of the cruelty we inflict upon one another? Eastern State Penitentiary forces us to confront the possibility that hell is not a distant realm ruled by supernatural demons, but something we are capable of creating right here on Earth, in places where human beings are stripped of their dignity, their hope, and ultimately their humanity itself. If stories like this one resonate with something deep within your soul, if you find yourself drawn to exploring the darkest corners of human experience and the uncomfortable truths they reveal about the nature of existence, then you absolutely must subscribe to this channel and become part of our community of truth seekers. We don't just tell ghost stories here, we excavate the profound spiritual and philosophical implications of supernatural phenomena, examining what they tell us about consciousness, morality, and the hidden darkness that lurks within the human heart. Every video is an invitation to question everything you think you know about life, death, and the mysterious forces that connect them. But more than that, I want to hear from you. Have you ever visited a place where you felt the weight of accumulated human suffering? Have you encountered something that made you question the boundaries between life and death? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might be the next one we explore together. And if this investigation into Eastern State's supernatural darkness affected you the way I intended, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who isn't afraid to look directly into the abyss of human experience. Together, we can continue to explore the most profound mysteries of existence and perhaps find some meaning in the darkness that surrounds us all.